Hi everyone, this is my presentation on inoculating the Australian public against online information disorders in the COVID-19 era. So the COVID crisis has really highlighted the threat that's posed to Australia by online so-called information disorders. Information disorder is a collective term for all forms of misinformation, disinformation, and even malinformation. Australian research has shown that misinformation about COVID-19 and public health measures such as vaccines has been widely disseminated over the past 2 years, and there is evidence that it's had an impact on COVID-19 vaccination rates, resulting in possibly extended lockdowns. Tackling information disorders can be very difficult due to the rate at which they propagate and the difficulty in debunking false beliefs. Obviously, there have been many attempts to control misinformation by blocking it before people get access to it, such as altering search algorithms or deleting misleading content. However, an emerging approach is to inoculate the public against misinformation so that they are more likely to recognize it when they see it. The most successful inoculation technique is called pre-bunking. This is the process of debunking lies, manipulative tactics, or unreliable sources before people actually fall for them. In 2019, the government requested that Australia's major digital platforms develop a voluntary code of practice to counter online information disorder. The process was monitored by the Australian Communications and Media Authority, which had the power to recommend the government introduce strict mandatory regulation if the industry-developed code wasn't up to scratch. The code was launched in February 2021, and the digital platforms report annually on their efforts. Many have pursued inoculation strategies, focusing on, among other things, improving media literacy among the Australian public, as you can see in this chart. As recommended by the ACCC and various advocacy bodies, the ongoing review of the Australian curriculum is considering an increased focus on digital and media literacies. In 2020, a number of bodies, including the ABC and so on, came together to establish the Australian Media Literacy Alliance, and one of their big focuses is inoculating Australians against information disorders. And I also just mentioned the ABC is quite active in this area, and I found it interesting their show Question Everything focused heavily on pre-bunking misinformation and disinformation. So that wraps up the government's initiatives that I've found. So in my opinion, the implementation of the Australian Code of Practice on Misinformation and Disinformation represents something of a roadmap for the government's future initiatives to combat information disorder. These inoculation and pre-bunking strategies, delivered by tech companies and not-for-profit through a model of networked governance, are likely to play an ever-increasing role in the future. The key reason for this is that the government simply doesn't have the capacity to manage information disorder by itself. It lacks the speed, flexibility, and in-house expertise needed to respond to new forms of misinformation as they arise. Instead, the government has to rely on networked actors with specialised knowledge to produce increased efficiency according to this principle of subsidiarity. That decision should be made at the most localised level possible. The focus on inoculating the public against misinformation, which inherently imbues people with responsibility for distinguishing fact from fiction, is an extension of this same subsidiarity principle. The government, in seeking to expand its capabilities, requires individual citizens to manage an ever-increasing range of their own affairs and risks, while continuing to steer the ship by exerting greater influence over their private beliefs and behaviour. This trend of responsibilisation is part of a broader paradigm shift occurring in governance and may be seen as a realisation of Foucault's concept of neoliberal governmentality. I will note that this method of tackling information disorder is not without its flaws. Relying on tech companies to deliver services will inevitably lead to some gaming of performance measures, leading to its own form of inefficiency. At the same time, responsibilising the public places a further strain on the finite time and resources of individuals. Nevertheless, the Australian government shouldn't rely on acting solely through the big digital platforms. While tech companies should be given responsibility for addressing information disorder on their own platforms, the government's focus should be on building broad-based community competencies, such as, for instance, media literacy and general critical thinking skills. These would not only help to protect Australians from information disorders, but also allow them to participate more fully in society. While Australia has made significant efforts to teach digital and media literacies in schools, incorporating them into the national curriculum, The government's approach to adult media literacy remains fragmented and ad hoc, focusing mostly on attempts to mitigate the harms of online scams and things of that sort. Governments in most other advanced democracies around the world now have a national framework for advancing media literacy, which facilitates greater collaboration between organisations, benchmarking and evidence-based approaches. I believe the Australian government should develop and pursue an ongoing and coherent national strategy of its own to develop media literacy and other 21st century skills. That's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening.